loudest silence I've ever known wasn't the absence of sound. It was the absence of my own voice in a room full of my own choices. For years, I lived in that silence, a ghost in a life I had carefully built, not for myself, but for an audience I couldn't even see. I was the architect of my own prison, and my warden was a desperate need for approval. My name is Amelia, and for the first 30 years of my life, I was a master of adaptation, a human chameleon. I blended into the expectations of my parents, my professors, my bosses, my partners. I was the good girl, the reliable employee, the low-maintenance friend. My entire identity was built on one question: what do they want me to be? Every morning I'd wake up and put on a mask, choosing the one I thought would win me the most validation that day. But living this way is exhausting. It's a lie, and the energy it takes to maintain a lie is energy you can never use to build a truth. The cracks in my life began to show, not as a big shatter, but as a slow, creeping chaos. Opportunities would vanish, relationships would turn exploitative, my life felt like a ship without a rudder, tossed around by everyone else's weather, and I was getting so tired of being seasick. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I had poured 6 months of my life, my evenings, my weekends, into a project I truly believed in. I presented it to my team, but my voice was hesitant, my words were full of apologies. Then a colleague, Mark, who had done almost none of the work, stood up and presented my core ideas as his own, but with this booming, unshakable confidence. The room was his. When I tried to reclaim my work, people just looked confused, like I was a child interrupting the adults. My boss later told me, with fake sympathy, that while my work was solid, I lacked executive presence. I wasn't being evaluated. I was an object that had failed evaluation. That night, I didn't just feel unseen. I felt erased. The silence in my apartment wasn't quiet anymore. It was a roaring vacuum where my sense of self used to be. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't just change my strategy. I couldn't just take a public speaking course. The problem wasn't the exterior, the problem was the architect. I had to tear the whole building down and start over. My journey of demolition and reconstruction began not in some corporate seminar, but in a small, dusty weaving studio in a forgotten town by the sea. I'd run away from the city, just seeking anonymity. The studio was run by an old woman named Alara. Her hands were gnarled and stained with dye, but they moved with this incredible grace. She didn't offer me any platitudes or 5-step plans. She just gave me a stool and pointed to a loom. "The world is a reflection," she said one afternoon, her voice as soft as raw wool as she watched me struggle with my tangled threads. "You are trying to please the tapestry, hoping it will tell you you're a good weaver. You have it backward. The weaver decides the pattern. The weaver holds the tension. The weaver is the source." This was my first lesson in what she called the Queen's framework. It had nothing to do with royalty or being dominant. It was about internal sovereignty. It was a radical shift from seeking external validation to living from a place of internal coherence. "You live as if you are a guest in the world, hoping you'll be invited to stay," Ilara told me, her eyes fixed on my clumsy hands. "Sovereignty is understanding that you are not a guest. You are the host of your own reality. You are the throne. You are the kingdom. But to claim that throne, I had to go into the dungeons of my own mind." Ilara explained that to become whole, you have to integrate all the parts of yourself, especially the parts you banish into the darkness. She called it the shadow. My shadow was a cellar filled with everything my good girl complex had rejected. My ambition, which I'd labeled as unseemly. My anger, which I'd called unladylike. My deep desire to be seen and celebrated, which I'd dismissed as narcissistic. For years, I had spent so much energy suppressing these parts of myself, like a dam operator frantically trying to hold back a river. Ilara taught me that true power wasn't in holding the river back. It was in letting the river flow through, integrating its immense energy. So, I began the terrifying work of acknowledging my shadow. I sat in silence and allowed myself to feel the raw, uncut ambition I had for my life. I gave my anger a voice, not to lash out, but to honor its message, that a boundary had been crossed, that my truth had been violated. I admitted to myself that I didn't just want to be solid, I wanted to be brilliant. Each time I acknowledged one of these rejected parts, it wasn't some monstrous explosion. It was a quiet homecoming. I felt this surge of energy, a reclaiming of power that had been leaking away for decades. The river wasn't destroying me, it was nourishing the very ground I stood on. This internal restructuring began to create an entirely new energetic field around me. The first test came when my landlord tried to impose an unfair rent increase. The old Amelia would have agonized, researched tenants' rights in secret, and then paid it just to avoid conflict. The new Amelia, acting from her integrated core, calmly scheduled a meeting. I didn't yell. I didn't plead. I simply sat down, looked him in the eye, and stated my position with clarity and conviction, presenting the facts without apology. I was no longer the object of his evaluation. I was the subject of my own, and I was evaluating the fairness of his proposal. He was so taken aback by this calm, centered presence that he rescinded the increase. He wasn't responding to a strategy, he was responding to the undeniable integrity of my inner posture. I started to understand that living from presence, that simple, profound state of I am here, was the antidote to living from fear, that constant anxious hum of what if I am truly seen and rejected? When you are fully present, you are a unified whole. There's no separation between your strong side and your sensitive side, your sovereign self and your connected self. You are the entire spectrum of human experience, held without judgment. This wholeness is magnetic. It doesn't attract chaos or exploiters because there are no cracks for them to wedge themselves into. Instead, it attracts respect, deep connection, and opportunities that are in true alignment. People like Mark, the colleague who stole my work, just seemed to fade from my reality. They needed a good girl to play against, and I was no longer auditioning for that part. My time with Alara was coming to an end. On my last day, I was weaving a small tapestry, my hands finally moving with a quiet confidence. The pattern was my own, a bold swirl of deep blues, fiery reds and shimmering golds, the very colors I had once hidden in my shadow. "You see," Alara said, gesturing to my work, "when the weaver is aligned, the threads find their own way. The pattern emerges. This is what the world calls synchronicity. It is not magic. It is the natural law of a coherent universe responding to a coherent soul." I returned to the world, but not to my old life. I didn't need to. Acting from my inner truth had opened paths that my strategic, people-pleasing mind could never have conceived of. I started a small consulting firm, helping artists and creators structure their businesses. My executive presence was no longer a performance. It was the simple, unshakable byproduct of my inner sovereignty. I didn't try to save my clients. I held a space for them to find their own power, becoming a mirror for their own sovereignty, just as Alara had been for me. And in doing so, I attracted the most incredible, high-quality relationships of my life. Partnerships built on mutual respect and authentic connection, not on need or validation. I realized the most profound truth of all. This wholeness, this sovereignty, was not something I had to achieve. It was my default setting. The endless searching and chronic dissatisfaction had all come from the mistaken belief that I was broken and needed to be fixed by someone or something outside of me. The journey wasn't about adding anything to myself. It was about stripping away all the layers of who I was not, to reveal the magnificent truth of who I had always been. Now, my life is not without its challenges. The waves still come. But I am no longer a rudderless ship. I am the lighthouse. I am grounded in my own being, my own truth. My authentic presence has become my most powerful magnetic field. It doesn't loudly announce itself, it simply is. It draws to me what belongs to me, and just as importantly, it gently and effortlessly repels what does not. The deafening silence is gone, replaced by the clear, resonant frequency of my own soul. And I have learned that when you finally decide to live from that place, you don't have to chase the life you desire. You simply become the energetic match for it, and with the quiet certainty of gravity, it comes to you. Thank you so much for listening. If this story resonated with you, I'd love for you to subscribe and join our community. See you in the next one.